Today on the Perception in Action podcast, Journal Club number 26, using verbal instructions in coaching. What should a coach say and when should they say it? So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and/or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. In today's episode, I had a really enjoyable discussion with Rajiv and Andrew about the issue of using verbal instructions as constraints in the skill acquisition process. Hope you enjoy. Okay, I think we're on. So welcome everyone to another edition of the Perception in Action Journal Club. I was just saying, we were talking a minute ago, I said if I went back in time, I would probably change the name of this from Journal Club to Roundtable, because we very rarely talk about one specific article. It's more about topics, and that's definitely true today. No, I could pick out some articles, I'm sure, but this is kind of going to be a kind of open discussion, think out loud kind of about verbal instruction. So I have two guests here today. I'm happy to returning both from interviews and doing one of these before. So I'll let them introduce themselves. Rajiv, how are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me on again. So I'm Rajiv Ranganathan. I'm an associate professor in the kinesiology department at Michigan State. I'm interested in motor learning and its application to rehabilitation.
And Andrew.
Cool. Hello, everybody again. I'm Andrew Wilson. I'm a reader in psychology at Leeds Beckett in Leeds in the UK. And I do experiments and theory stuff around the ecological approach and to perception and action.
Cool. And so for those following along, of course, if you have any comments or questions you want to put in here, we're happy to talk about them. As I said, this is going to be a pretty open discussion. So if you have anything. So basically what we wanted to talk about today is verbal instruction from a coach, right? So what should a coach say? And I posted a kind of a teaser on Twitter earlier. It's kind of a joke, but it's sort of true, right? We've gone from bashing coaches for saying too much, right? They're being overly prescriptive, and you shouldn't say, you should be a designer more than an instructor, to almost this other extreme a lot of people believe where we're promoting that coaches should say nothing at all, right? It's all about designing a practice, setting some constraints, and then you stay out of the way and let the athletes self-organize. And obviously those are over exaggerations, but so what we want to do is, what's in the middle ground there, right? What should a coach be saying? What should a coach be instructing? And of course, there's lots of rules for what coaches say, motivational, all these go, but we want to focus, we're skill acquisition kind of people. So that's primarily what we want to focus on. And we'll talk about that. So what inspired this a little bit for me was inviting you two guys was a couple. Yeah, I think Andrew started a Twitter thread. You're doing a lot of these, raising, and then, it was, it was a lot of it was you were just kind of posing questions, kind of thinking aloud, exactly what I was. And then you've had a very nice response, kind of a differing view, which I think a lot of people would subscribe to. So that's what kind of inspired me to invite you guys on to do this. So maybe it would make sense, Andrew, to start with you again and talk about kind of what your thread and kind of what you were thinking about with that.
Yeah, cool. So, the issue of verbal instruction and what you can and can't do with it has sort of become a flashpoint, at least on social media. I don't know if actually in person, but on social media, on Twitter, it's really become a flashpoint for the ecological types versus the not ecological types. And one of the big things that keeps coming up from the non-ecological types is, well, you say I'm not allowed to talk to my athletes. And that's clearly not true. But then the issue is, well, there is this, within the ecological sort of approach to coaching at the moment, there is not an aversion, but there is a move away from verbal instruction, and the emphasis becomes about designing physical environments. And so my initial thread was mostly just sort of thinking out loud about why that was. Why is it, where has that preference come from, and why is it there? So from my point of view, it's about thinking about what verbal instruction can do for skill acquisition. And one of the things that from an ecological point of view, it can't do is it can't make you perform a movement in a specific way. It can't. Verbal instruction is not the kind of thing that can that changes the kinematics of a motion, right? You can use verbal instruction to say pick up the red cup versus pick up the blue cup, right? But then the details of that reach to grasp movement are all about the law-based use of perceptual information about the location of the cup, about its affordances for grasping and all that sort of stuff. So from an ecological point of view, one of the issues around using verbal instruction is that it's really limited in what it can do. If you want people to move differently, then actually what you really need to do is you need to present them with perceptual information that's being created by the affordances of a physical environment, because that's how we organize our movements in real time. So I think lurking under that is that's one of the ideas that's lurking under the sort of the reticence around using verbal instruction from an ecological approach. I think then the other part of it, so then the question is, well, are you not allowed to use verbal instructions? I don't think, and I think hopefully we'll get into this. Clearly, it's not the case that you can't use verbal instructions. The question is, what can you use them for, and what can you not use them for, in terms of shaping these things. So what I was getting up to was on Twitter. Well, I was just thinking through why we think verbal instruction might be a bug rather than a feature. And part of the issue is, again, that given the way we think about where actual performance and skill acquisition, how that happens in terms of perception action loops and all that sort of good stuff. If you want to interface with those, then actually verbal instructions created without an understanding of what the physical environment is affording and enabling is just going to get in the way, right? So, and that's why there's that reticence. You want people to self-organize their movements and think about the way those movements happen rather than doing one thing rather than another thing. Then you've got to manipulate the physical environment. But then the big question, I think, I'll hand over to Rajiv at this point, is that so now the question, well, what can you do with them, right? And where do we go from there?
Yeah, no, I think that, and to set you up, so obviously verbal instruction in the ecological approach is not something that doesn't fit. It's a constraint, right? It's a task constraint. It perfectly fits within the model. But the one, I think, dominant idea I think that you're kind of expressing, Andrew, is using verbal instruction in a completely different way. Like, for example, to educate attention, to point to it, rather than in a more prescriptive, this is how you should do the activity. So and there's this kind of and I've been part of a movement away from any type of prescription in terms of the movement. And Rajiv, I think you kind of, maybe that we're running away from that too fast, right? I think that's part of what your message I was trying to get in your post.
I mean, I think, again, I trained with Carl Noel, so I'm a big fan of the constraints approach, no doubt. I just think, I've been thinking about this more recently, is whether, almost presenting this dichotomy between constraints and prescription is sort of as real as, we try to make it in theory. And so, going back to verbal instructions, right? If I told somebody, hey, whatever, extend your elbow this way and flex your wrist this way. Something say that we would normally think of as being very prescriptive. I still think it still poses only a constraint, right? It's the person has an understanding of what they are supposed to do, but there isn't. I mean, again, in my view, it's not a prescription in the sense of the person is going to do exactly the same thing that you told them. They're still going to somewhat approximate it, right? I mean, they're not going to really do exactly the thing that you said just because you prescribed it. And so I was thinking about more of the idea of, well, maybe this trying to force everything between prescription and constraints in practice may not be as real as a difference as we'd like to see it in theory. And again, sort of going back to the idea of these, we talked about this idea of, prescription is towards some optimal movement pattern, right? Which of course, ignores a lot of stuff in the sense that, well, not everybody has the same optimum. Even for the same person, it may vary and so on. But I think I was just thinking about it in the sense of, well, the optimum approach, right, guiding people towards some optimum approach may not really be a desired endpoint, but rather sort of a practical compromise, right? So if you don't know all the solutions that work really well, and you have a few individuals who are already very good. I mean, I'll take baseball pitching as an example, right? So the throwing form of people who can pitch at 100 miles an hour. Well, maybe it's not such a bad idea to use that as at least an approximation of, well, at least I know these will get there. If you sort of take a pure constraints approach and not prescribe anything, it could potentially lead to some, suboptimal exploration, right? Exploration is good, but exploration can also be suboptimal in the sense that you find something that works for the moment, but sort of prevents your long-term advance in terms of skill acquisition. So I was just thinking about it in terms of maybe, yes, if somebody really believes there's only one optimal approach for everybody, that may not be as good, but the idea of guiding people towards some optimum might still have some value in the absence of information about what other things actually could potentially work.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of good points there. And I think it's almost a straw man in the opposite end, like the constraint. Like the example Bernstein's blacksmith doesn't suddenly do underhand one time and sidearm, right? I think you're talking, there's a coordination, there's a profile to a good baseball pitcher. Some can throw underhand, but so maybe we should give you, okay, here's what you need to do, right? In some way, even though my worry sometimes I've seen I think there's a lot of different things to pull it. I remember kind of a prescriptive approach to when I learned was taught golf as a kid. And it seemed, the problem I had with that, it was, if you let me, I totally agree with, I think we all agree that our point, Franz Bosch was sum up, the body has little interest in what the coach has to say. You can't tell, you're right, you can't make people, but it seems like a lot of the really traditional coaching methods are really focused on actually making the form rather than performing that. They separated the goal. Like, I think you're right? If you let someone, they would not listen to you. Oh, this is working. I'm not gonna. But sometimes it was so instructive, and then as a kid, I couldn't do the movement they wanted, so I was like, I'm done. Yeah.
I was thinking actually while you were talking, Rajiv, that there's a bit of it's almost there is this conflation actually, I think, of two different things, which is the use of verbal instruction, and the other thing is the idea or the notion that there is one correct technique, right? So if you think there is an ideal technique, then verbal instruction can be a good way of conveying what that technique is in terms of joint angles and all that sort of good stuff. But verbal instruction does not necessarily have to be that. It's almost as if the problem that we have is the use of verbal instruction to coach a technique rather than the use of verbal instruction. It's almost like the concern from the ecological approach is the package rather than the elements. But it's become, we don't like verbal instruction, has become kind of the shorthand maybe. I was just, because I was just realizing as you were pointing out that was lurking a little bit under there, is this notion of what's the complaint about verbal instruction is that it's overly prescriptive. And the other thing I was thinking about as well, of course, and the other concern about verbal instruction, just given around a technique or around a form, or even used, to sort of guide what people are doing. One of the issues is then that the question of the representativeness of the training environment then immediately rears its head, because, of course, in a game environment, you don't have the coach providing that verbal information to feed into what you're doing with the shape of the thing. So say you're holding holding a hockey stick or shooting a basketball or whatever. If during practice you were leaning quite heavily on what it was the coach was telling you in terms of where to put your weight or whatever, from a representative design point of view, that's not a good fit for the information that's present in the game context. And so you're not going to expect a lot of successful transfer of ability from the training environment through to the game environment, which is the whole point of training, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, some of that I think is. I mean, I completely agree with that point, and I think it's common to a lot of the feedback literature as well, right? And augmented feedback literature, where one of the things that you try to do during training is fade away this extra information, whether it's from the coach or whether it's from or even constraint, like even if you manipulate the design environment in some physical way, presumably that's not going to carry over as well. But you try to sort of move them away or wean them away from the extra manipulations that you've done, so that then it transfers well, right? So to me, that sort of concern would be is I think it's very true in terms of it applies to a lot of stuff. But I think there's ways to potentially mitigate that serious consequence of, well, I don't have that coach yelling in my ear or whatever.
By
sort of
that's funny though. Thinking about the fading feedback idea and the idea that you want to give them that initial support early on, right? That's another thing I hear from coaches, is that they want to be able to tell the novice what to do, right? They want to be able to use verbal instruction in order to get them into the ballpark. And I was thinking, I run experiments on coordination stuff, finger wiggling and all that sort of good old-fashioned Kelso stuff. And I've got a feedback method that I use that isn't prescriptive in the sense that it tells you what to do, but it's sort of it's real-time feedback about whether you're moving at the required coordination. And I fade it, right? I started out with a nice big bandwidth to get you into the ballpark and narrow it down in order to get you better. So, and it works gangbusters like that. Doing it like I have to shape my constraint over time like a funnel, right? So that intuition is like, that's clearly a thing, and we're all worried about it, and it does keep coming up. But it's interesting that it connects to the, again, there's that sense when in thinking about it that way of you want to use the verbal instructions at the beginning and then wean them off the verbal instruction. That's an interesting idea all by itself, thinking about how to use verbal instruction. And whacking time into that question of how you use verbal instruction.
This is a comment I get a lot from coaches is, I like the idea of self-organization and constraints and stuff, but how do I give them, the word I get a lot is the fundamentals. I think it's exactly what you're talking about. What's the basic coordination profile? Like an example I use, like think about setting a volleyball. Not only is there a way that experts tend to do that, there's rules about what's legal, right? So to someone to find that on their own without giving them any, like they won't, because they wouldn't know the rules. They need to know those constraints. But I guess do you think is verbal instruction the best way to go with conveying that? I think observation might be a little, is that because we all know the kind of dangers of, we get into the internal, if Nick were here, the internal, external cues issue and things. But what do you think, Rajiv? Is it, do you think that's a good place to start, to just give people the basic form, and do you think that we need to do that? I think you would agree that we kind of need to put people in the right ballpark, maybe, to start off with. Yeah.
I mean, I think it, it comes back to what context specifically we're talking about, right? So there are certain cases where, I mean, I'm thinking about like sort of what Andrew was referring to, especially early on skill learning. The things that verbal instruction to me have going for it is it's cheap and it doesn't require technology, right? So it's sort of like there's lots of contexts where that sort of even a small nudge towards the right pattern might help. I think, it's definitely, I would say it complements observation, right? So, like, definitely you want to have an idea of what, let's say it's whatever, if it's throwing, and somebody has an idea of what overhand throwing looks like before they start. But as things progress, I think it might be helpful for verbal instructions occasionally to sort of just nudge them towards certain parts of the workspace so that they're exploring more efficiently. That's sort of where I think verbal instructions really have value. Is just this, they're cheap and they're quick. You don't have to have a whole lot of things to work at, which I think in a field setting is really helpful when you're watching 40 students how to do something. Well, that helps a lot.
But if you don't know, if you don't have a good reason to guide their attention one way or another, or just to make them pay attention to one thing over another, right? This is one of the things that comes up is that from an ecological point of view, using verbal instruction without some sort of guiding set of principles can actually harm much more than it can help. So you've got this chance of helping, but actually the odds are pretty good that if you don't have a reason to give a particular kind of verbal instruction, then you're actually going to actively harm the skill acquisition process. So again, for me, it keeps coming back to it's like like the discussion last week about why pick a theory, and you have to kind of have a reason to be doing something one way rather than another way, and you also have to know what that reason is. Or else you just end up doing that thing or that thing because you think that that's the way to go, but you don't know why it works and you don't have an understanding of what to do when it fails. And it's like, again, so maybe to pivot and think a bit more productively, right? You're clearly right? Verbal instruction is cheap. Everyone can do it. Everyone can understand it. So now the question becomes, how do you do it properly? How do you do it in a way that is just going to maximize the odds that it's actually going to be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I had a sort of note in there, sort of, talking about exactly this point, right? So what do you give verbal instructions about is, I think, a separate ballgame from, are they useful?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
And I certainly agree with the point that it can be done badly, right? So it can be, and this is where I think this distinction between, biomechanics and coordination really comes in, right? So you can measure all these things, whether it's angles or forces or moments or whatever, but I don't think if you sort of prescribe or subscribe to the idea that your underlying control is low dimensional, right? It's not that the brain is controlling every joint angle independently and one doing some kind of motion. Then trying to find that underlying thing that to give verbal instructions about, I think is definitely something worth considering. My sense is like, expert coaches may have an intuitive sense for what it is. I'm thinking about things like, stepping with the wrong leg, for example, right? When you step with the wrong leg when you're throwing, it messes up your hip rotations and it messes up everything sort of beyond the chain. And so just switching that thing from, you're stepping with the wrong leg fixes a lot of things, right? Without having to give them instruction about every little thing that needs to be fixed down the chain. But again, my sense is people have some sort of intuitive one. At least good coaches have an intuitive understanding of it. But I'm absolutely, I agree with the point that we really need to find a better way of talking about language in terms of what the verbal instructions need to be about. I'm sort of, again, I agree with the view that, it's probably not biomechanical variables, at least the way they're typically analyzed. It's I don't think, trying to give instruction about every possible angle in the body is necessarily helpful. I think there's something low dimensional there in a task that can suddenly flip a lot of things if you got it right.
Yeah, I think those are the great points. I think you're right. I think from the kind of the theoretical perspective, it's more what should we be saying? Because you're right. Like once we decide a player's too upright and they need to bend their knees more, I think we'd all agree, like you were suggesting, right? If saying that you need to bend your knees exactly 45 degrees and giving, so it wouldn't, but we could do the same thing with an analogy, with the explicit, right? Yeah. So I think we got a good understanding, and Nick's book goes on this, and then Gabby Wolf's work on how, if we decide what we want to change, I think we have a good feeling of how to do it the right way. in the the way. But you're right. The key is what, how much, and you're right. I to me, it always why do you want, like your description of the wrong foot is like a perfect way to think about it. I think you're breaking the kinetic chain. You're not getting as much velocity. So I think we lose the why a lot of times, and we get these traditional passed down orthodoxies about how to move, and we forget why we're doing it anymore. Andrew, were you gonna?
Yeah, I think lots of things. I've had, a couple of conversations over the last couple of days in which that theme of losing track of the why we do things, being a thing that some coaches and academics who overlap into the coaching world in various kinds of ways, it's a thing that's really on their minds, I think. So it just so happened, that's just happens to have come up a few times in a few different conversations for me. And I think, and again, that feeds back to one of the things I like about taking an ecological approach is that you tend to you tend to fall into it on purpose rather than by default. And when you come into it on purpose, you tend to have engaged with the why in order to arrive at the ecological approach. And that's just sort of for historical reasons, because we're not the default, right? You have to switch to us, right? I think one of the nice side effects of that is that ecologically minded people think about the why all the time, and so we know that it's a question, and we think it's important, and I tend to think that it is important because the why, like the why of why you do that thing rather than another thing is it's an important part of coaching, I think. And I think one of the frustrations around verbal instruction is definitely this issue of the why do you do it and what do you guide to? What is it that's guiding you to say one thing rather than another thing that doesn't appear. And do you know what? One of the very legitimate limits right now of the ecological approach that people call out is we don't really have a good language for it. You can say that verbal instruction is a constraint. I mean, that's obviously how we would go about using it, but we kind of the research world doesn't really yet have a good, solid ecological way of thinking about what speech and language are in terms of what they can do to guide action and skill acquisition and various kinds of other things. It's coming, it's been developing. There's people getting interested, and it's one of those things that's happening. But I also think that sort of historically, I think the coaching world is kind of lagging us by about 15, 20 years, not for any bad reason, just because it took about that long for the ideas to start percolating through. And they're doing what we did 15, 20 years ago, which is picking off the low fruit and manipulating the physical environment where you can get big effects and you can really kind of understand what's going on. Something like understanding what kind of constraint a speech act is a really difficult question ecologically. My bet is we can cope with it, but it's a big ask, and we don't have good questions yet. So that's the other thing, is that it's a very legitimate challenge that we get thrown at us. Is, well, then how do we do it? And I've got some ideas, but I don't have the same level of evidence base for manipulating verbal instruction the way I do a physical environment to provide a certain kinds of affordances. And so, it's a very legitimate question that we can't quite put our money where our mouth is right now. But I think the time is clearly right? There's clearly a hunger for an answer to the question, which just means that we need to start cracking on. I mean, I know that people are, and there have been people are starting to think about this, which is great, but it's a hard problem.
Yeah, I would part of it for me is it's kind of like a frames of reference problem, right? A verbal instruction is explicit, often third person verbal description. And really in the ecological approach, we kind of believe you don't use any of that to control your movement. So how do I convert? And that's what designing good cues and things is all about, right? How do I tap into this other system? But you're right. I don't think we have a good, framework for what exactly we're trying to achieve. We're not trying to make your body exactly aligned in a certain way. What are we trying to do exactly? I think we're a bit vague on that, I fully admit. Yeah.
I mean, Sabrina, and to a certain lesser extent, Sabrina and I have written some papers trying to just start to articulate that framework and start to divvy up the ground. And I think we're making some sort of progress. But it's super early days, and it's not at all clear how to do things. I was thinking as well about, like, you know, what you were saying, Rajiv, about finding how could you verbally guide attention to the low dimensional solution that's actually being operated on, given that one of the reasons why it's taken so long for us to identify those is that they're not part of our normal sort of experience of how we're moving. We don't conceptualize, and we're not consciously aware of our movements, I don't think, kind of in those terms. And so again, like, how do you direct someone's attention to that when they've never considered that's how their body moves, you know? And analogy, Rob, you were talking about, you know, I think some coaches, as they try and find ways of using movement to not overload with specific irrelevant detail, but still to get you into a useful ballpark, you know, people want to use things like analogies: move like a tree, move like a wave, move your arm like this, you know, pretend you're about to jump, whatever. Again, that I think starts heading in your direction, Rajiv. It starts heading towards that low dimensional solution. But again, right now, there's no good guiding principle for telling you, like, which one of those things what's the right analogy. Because, of course, all the analogies are to experiences, and some of those experiences just don't map onto how the thing actually goddamn works, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I have a somewhat slightly different view on you know, like, this sort of dialogue between research and coaching. I think I'm sort of the view of, I see them as parallel tracks rather than sequential in terms of, well, the research needs to go first before it sort of filters into coaching.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
And sort of, I mean, I think it's always worked that way historically as well, right? I mean, people came up with the Fosbury flop before people talked about center of mass being, you know, lower than the bar or whatever. I think there's definitely, I mean, I see them as parallel. And like I said, a lot of things, like we talked about, this idea of a low dimensional thing that people are manipulating. I mean, my sense is people have some intuitive understanding of how that works, and maybe not be sort of quantifiable in the way we would like. But I think there's definitely stuff that, you know, potentially can cross boundaries. So I kind of think of them as parallel. I would, you know, again, being a motor learning researcher myself, I would really hesitate if everybody were dependent on advances in motor learning. That would be
that is a fair point.
No,
the Olympic sports would be key pressing, reaching, grasping.
Yeah, you tell some academic they've got a deadline for the next Olympics, and it's just like, I just have another couple of months. I've got a lot of marking.
Sorry, we might be able to add skateboarding in about 100 years. When we get some slight intuition about, no, I think that's really good. So going back to you guys, just so kind of for people listening, the low dimensional, you're talking about things like describing, like in running, people have a certain phase. We can describe a really complex activity on a simple variable, like the relationship between your phase of your legs. But so you're running some different pattern. How do you convey to someone, you need to change the phase relationship of your, like, right. I think you're right. I completely agree with you, Raj. I think they're connected in parallel, I would say too. I think the experiential knowledge of coaches figures out these kind of things in a very different way than we would, you know, without having, you know, then we'd want to prove it and, you know, and test it. And so I think we could definitely learn from both. Yeah.
And I mean, that's where, I mean, they have the advantage in the domain expertise, right? I mean, at least in the context of one particular task, they know what works, they know what doesn't. That knowledge may not be generalizable to other kinds of motor learning tasks, but I think having that, you know, like you said, the experiential knowledge of a single domain often cues them to certain things that a researcher looking from a much farther view may not be able to sort of, you know, get at in terms of like an experiment sort of thing. But yeah, it's important to talk to each other.
That makes me think of a question that I don't know the answer to, and that is, are there good examples of coaches going from one sport to another sport and doing quite well at both of them? There must, presumably, I was just thinking about your issue, Rajiv, about like their expertise being contained to actually a fairly particular domain. I just started thinking about, does expertise in verbally instructing and coaching athletes in football help in roller skating? I don't know.
Yeah.
I would certainly think there would some that would want to argue that there's the fundamentals are similar, like running in one sport's the same as running. Like Franz would want to say that, he could, and Dan Paff, who coaches lots of different sports. So you're right, but I think so they're basic like things like that. I would say, there's coaches cross boundary, but you rarely see a soccer coach go to basketball.
Right.
I don't think there would be. It would be interesting. That's an interesting question.
I don't know the answer to that. My first thought was similar to yours, Rob, in terms of there's certain commonalities, like whatever. Throwing sports may have some commonalities, things like that, but completely a different domain might be harder, I think.
Yeah, and I think so I think we've kind of established. So I've had a couple comments in that is it fair to describe verbal prescription as necessarily prescriptive? No, I think we're saying that it doesn't have to be. No, but I think what we're saying is not prescriptive, but setting boundaries or, kind of pushing people in. I think that's what you were kind of thinking, Rajiv, right? Kind of directed rather than prescriptive, maybe is a better word.
Yeah. And there's also this other kind of instruction that seems to have, people don't talk about it as much, but Carl Newell and Les Carlton, they did a lot of work on this idea of what's called transition information, right? So it's not simply telling them what the endpoint is, but sort of taking into account where they are and what they need to do to move to the next level, which I think sort of fits very nicely with this idea of knowing the intrinsic dynamics to some extent, right? Sort of where they are and what they need to do to move from there to the next point, rather than just say, hey, here's the endpoint. This is what the endpoint is. And I think there's at least a few studies there. And I think remember Les Carlton's work on throwing, where they used the developmental scale of throwing in terms of, there's a progression of a very immature form to what we think of a mature form, and using that as a way of saying, well, if you're at stage 4, then your real instruction is, X, whereas if you're in stage 7, then maybe to move to 8, you need a completely different set of instructions. So I think it's a nice way of thinking about instructions, again, more than prescriptive, is it can also sort of take account of where you are currently and then move you to the next step. So which I think fits nicely again with I really like that idea too, and I think it's something I'd also connect that with kind of Michael's and Jacob's information for learning. So it's kind of like telling you about the trajectory you're on rather than your performance, right? It's how you're moving through this. It's a really nebulous nebulous concept that we're still kind of understanding, but I think it's a really nice idea.
Could you give me a slightly more specific example, Rajiv? I don't know that I'm familiar with this work. I'm just trying to...
So, again, the paper I remember most is one where they were teaching people to throw with their non-dominant hand, right? So which is, one of those things which takes a long time to do reasonably well. And they were using this idea of transition information, meaning your goal is not to describe what the endpoint is, which would be, some instructions you could say, well, here's the mature form, go for it, right? Which is sort of where they are at the moment. Whereas if you are, say, at a stage 1 where you're, say, not stepping, right? Then you would say, okay, you need to move to step 2, you need to do X. Whereas somebody who, say, was at step, 4 or 5, I don't remember the stages.
Yeah, sure.
But the instructions towards the goal vary as a function of where you are. So it's not simply prescriptive account like what people would normally do. Ideal, go for it, but you sort of tailor the instructions based on
what's the one thing to get you to the next place.
Exactly. Sort of like what's your weakest link sort of thing.
Okay, no, that's useful.
The example I like to use, I don't know if this is quite what he had in mind, but to me it's not verbal, it's more one of the constraints we use in baseball pitching is a connection ball. So if a pitcher's arm is separating from their body too early, when they're throwing, it can cause injury. So what you do is you get them to hold a rubber ball under their arm against their body while they pitch. So their main goal is still to throw the ball at the target. But what you tell them to do is pitch so that the ball, when it falls out, it goes towards where you throw the ball. So if you separate too early, the ball falls and goes sideways. So the direction that ball goes is not feedback about your main task. It's kind of feedback about whether your solution is getting you there, how your solution is progressing to solve this problem. So that's my kind of best one I can think of. But I think it's a really interesting idea. So I think the other idea to me, I think we can talk about where we'd want to kind of push verbal instruction is encouraging exploration. Right. So, and I've often said, like, one of the things I would like to see more done in the focus of attention literature is kind of tease it. So I think external instructions are good because they're less prescriptive, right? They don't move your body this way. They say push the ground away this way, which you can do in more. But they also, depending on how you word them, they encourage you to kind of try different things if you just focus on the outcome. So, so I don't know. I think there's lots of different ways that we can rethink of verbal instruction. Getting people, pointing people to information, look at the, I don't know, look at the gaps in the players, things like that. So I think
that's one thing I was also, sort of been thinking about is this, the internal versus external focus. I think is a nice line of work. One thing that, like you just mentioned, that fits in well with that problem is the problem of the redundancy itself, right? There's lots of things that can happen at the internal level that can all lead to the same external outcome. So it would be nice to see whether, like you said, whether the external focus not only encourages, say, more exploitation of redundancy, but then somebody could also come in and say, well, maybe, in some cases at least, it could potentially lead you to a suboptimal solution that's good enough for now, but not good enough for later. So in that case, the internal focus, even though it may affect your performance now, could potentially be a better solution in the long term. I don't know if that's true, but I mean, I think it might. It brings about this idea that the internal and external focus are connected by the redundancy in the task. And again, most tasks we study don't have that much redundancy, which is again something that we probably need to fix as a field. But I think it's one potential factor that mediates that internal external focus studies.
That's another question I have, and maybe this gets into some of the work you do, Rajiv, too, in rehab, kind of whether we can do, to me, I have real doubts that we can do this. There's a lot of this pressure to give short-term gains. Look at all the classic contextual interference studies, right? You do learn faster if you cheat, right? And give people a solution and don't randomize things. But the idea is we like to believe it's not as good in the long run. And so I think there's a temptation for people who want to do that. But I have my kind of doubts whether it's how effectively you can switch from giving a solution to switching to letting people take advantage of redundancy. I don't know what you guys think about that. Because I get the pressure that coaches and physicians have of, I only have so long to work with these people. I can't let them try everything, right? I need to give them something. So I totally understand that pressure, but I worry about, how you're going to transition from that if you really want to do something else.
Yeah, that's it. Taking the longer term view actually is really important. So it's funny, thinking about things that we do academically in the field, we study learning, we bring you in and give you 50 trials of practice over 20 minutes and call that learning, right? It turns out to be really important to study retention, for example, over reasonably long timescales, actually, because actually the whole contextual interference and the variability of training sort of stuff doesn't show up until later, right? And that's the whole point, is that you've got to take that longer view, and then you've got to make the decision about which one of those things you actually want. Do you know, actually, I think about this. I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of teaching research methods to first-year psychology undergraduates, which was a thing I used to do. And then I finally realized a couple of years ago, I hadn't actually ever put this together explicitly, but I realized I was doing it in a very constraints-based way. Because of course I was like, how do I think people learn, right? And again, because when you're, and there's that, especially for something like stats, right? There's that sense that people are starting at zero, and you have to just give them some knowledge, otherwise you'll never get them moving. And I've come to the conclusion I don't actually think that's true. I think you have to just, you have to set scenes, and you have to give them things to do, and there's ways of doing it. And I'm sort of still kind of thinking about articulating it, but there's just that urge. And I felt this urge. So I used to run these classes. They'd be small classes, and I'd do the same delivery to multiple classes across the week. And they'd work in small groups. I'd give them a little mini lecture at the beginning to set the scene, and then they'd go off and do some work. And I never gave them lists of step-by-step instructions on how to use SPSS, but I taught them how to go look things up on YouTube and in their textbook, right? And even sort of where I'm coming from and what I think works and how I think stuff works, right? I would be wandering around and taking questions, and the students would be nervous, and they would want some help. And they would want to know how to do something, and they were feeling genuinely bad about their inability to do the new thing that they were doing in class that day. And the urge to just tell them the answer was so strong, and I really had to kind of fight it off, because I really wanted to help, and I had to start finding ways to support them without giving them the answer, so that they made it through that little tough period. And it's really complicated, and it's really hard. So it's funny, I'm really sympathetic to all those issues that you were just talking about, Rob, and I've just been thinking about them. I'm not a sports coach, but I've done a lot of teaching over the years, and that we all do that. And I actually think the issues are they're very similar. And no one's, as far as I can tell, if anybody knows, I would love to know, nobody's really taken a constraints-led approach to classroom delivery.
Yeah.
But it seems like a really interesting domain, because especially for teaching something like research methods or statistics, right? It kind of all exists in language. It doesn't exist in physical activity other than mouse clicking on Jasper stats or on SPSS or whatever. It seems like a really, really intriguing domain. It's been on my head. I don't know how to engage with it because it's not my area, but I've been thinking about it as a domain. And then, all that stuff about the internal and external focus of attention, that literature, again, about this consequence of the way you use verbal instruction, about where you guide attention. There's just a huge literature on that. Again, it seems to be a great place to go looking for ideas, but also, as you were identifying, there's a bunch of stuff still to do in that domain. Some very, really important questions. I loved the idea, Rajiv, about using more, doing focus of attention stuff with tasks that provide more opportunity for redundancy and all that kind of stuff, and looking to see, whack some UCM on it, right? Not do they move that way versus that way, but, does the good variability outstep the way the bad? Do they start showing, do different instructions facilitate not doing the thing, but doing the thing in that flexible, adaptive way that we think is the right way, is the best way to do it, and so on. Yeah, sorry, that was just me. That was all the stuff that was happening in my head while listening to you guys talking. I just wanted to get it out there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I mean, maybe going back to your point, Robin, about to rehab, I think one of the things, there was this article, I remember maybe a few months ago, maybe a year ago, on Lance Klusner, and the cricket batter who was a very big hitter, right? So sort of known for his big hitting, and they asked him how he trained, and he said, "Well, I use a ball machine." And it was sort of, it took me by surprise. That's the worst way to do it. But one of the things that, he had a quite sort of nuanced view. He said, yes, there may be other techniques that are helpful, but none of them gets me the number of practice trials that I can get in a ball machine, right? Which is something we always sort of control for in the experiment. So I think that's one of the reasons why translation from sort of the motor learning experiment world to the real world is complicated, because the things, like you said, we only have a certain amount of time. And, would I rather have 4 trials of the best possible learning method or 400 trials of something that works reasonably? We don't think about these compromises in the experiment world, but this is exactly the kind of question that, coach needs to be focused on. And I think it's, which is why I think, we also need to be thinking more about things like, effect sizes, right? What's really, is for example, if one repetition gives you a much bigger effect size than fine tuning all the perfect recipe for motor learning, maybe it's better to even skip that phase. So I mean, I don't know if that's true, but I just feel like that's something that we ignore in our experiments because we tightly control for how many trials they do and and those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think that's a point Carl's made in a number of papers. Is we hardly, if ever, really did study coordination in research, right? People show up already with a basic pattern. Like I can think of golf experiments I've done where I've used kind of a constraint self-organization approach, but someone shows up that doesn't know anything about golf, how to stand. What do? I tell them. I tell them, oh, you got to do this. Like I don't let them come up with the basic. We very rarely take which was what coaches have to do, right? They have people, especially with kids, that have never tried things. Yeah.
And it's funny as well as, you're right. Like we don't study the process of getting the basic coordinative structure very much. And it's funny, like one of the things that finally made me realize that was that the Jacobs and Michaels direct learning paper came out. What is it? 2007. Like that's, we always think we've been talking about learning and development, and E.J. Gibson was doing all her cool stuff, and people, Karen Adolph does great developmental work, and there's all this kind of stuff. But I suddenly realized that in 2007 was the first kind of ecological way of thinking about how you go from zero to something, which is, it's a, not quite zero, but how do you kind of get in the game? Like, how do you begin the process of attuning, right? How do you begin that process? We always get people who are some way into that process, which is what you were just saying. But it then becomes, that's the problem, is like, how do you make your first throw? How do you make your first golf swing? How do you make your first whatever, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And how do you make your first golf swing so that it's a golf swing rather than a baseball bat swing, right? If you pick up that club, what makes you do one? And
it's funny. It seems like we can do it either way. Like with the initial start, like the example I always like to use is running. Like I don't think there's very many of us that had any explicit verbal instruction about how to run from anyone.
We have a lot of evolutionary timescale stuff going on there. Same with throwing, right? And it's like, that's why, right? Running is well, except that you do have to learn how to run, right? So one of my favorite, if you're ever bored and you've got a small child that's just learned how to walk, right? This is like Karen Adolph stuff. You stick them at the top of a ramp so that they pick up too much speed, and so that their walking is no longer a stable coordination pattern for locomotion down that. And normally what happens, when you're a little bit older, is that you then transition into running as you increase the speed. But there's that point where little kids have learned how to walk, but they have not yet learned how to run. And when their walking disintegrates, they fall over, and it's hilarious, right? But that's like, so there is like at some point, like running is sufficiently different from walking that at some point you do it for the first time.
Yeah.
I think the point about the complexity of the task, it's we've been saying that for quite a number of years now. There just seems to be, I don't know, like for an academic environment, it just seems too difficult to manage. I think this could be one of those things that it could be like a team science project, right? So not one lab that does everything, but maybe something that, because I think we need to fix at some point. I think keeping saying that we're not addressing the coordination aspect, to me, that is a big part of the picture, especially at the beginning, Rob saying, if we're not thinking about the motivation and the other sort of psychological aspects, well, then the main skill happens sort of early on in that phase. So sort of ignoring that is to our own peril.
That's why I'm really excited about all the motor abundance stuff, all the, uncontrolled manifold and all stochastic optimal control and TNC, all those analysis methods are, I think, potentially, I'm really intrigued by their potential to give us a window so that you could study a fairly complicated movement, but reduce it down to a manageable, understandable coordinative structure in the maths, right?
Yeah.
But also then you could start doing manipulations, right? So what do the kinematics look like when you're tired, right? Versus, and it's not just, oh, they moved slower, but they were more rigid, they were less flexible, they were less adaptive, right? And again, it's that emphasis of studying process rather than outcome. And but again, that's why I've been super excited about all these methods, because I think that, there are finally some people have shown up and thrown some fairly heavy duty maths at a problem that needed some heavy duty maths, and that was never going to come from the biomechanist and the psychologist like me. Mm-hmm. But now that those things exist, I'm really intrigued by their potential But I think you're right. I think we as a field need to see that potential in those analyses and figure out how to use them properly. Yeah. So that's what I'm doing at the moment with I think before we started, I've got a big data set of motion capture data from a throwing experiment I did a couple of years ago, and I'm collaborating with colleagues up the road at Carnegie who know about UCM and all these things. It's taken us a while to get going for lots of reasons, but we're at the point now where we're starting to do the UCM. And kind of for me, I'm structuring the project to kind of like, we're doing a fairly sort of bog standard UCM kind of thing, fairly standard kind of analysis. But then I also want to start thinking about more, how to connect a UCM analysis that is, the organization of the variability in the movement relative to a task goal. What happens if you quantify that task goal not as the orientation of your hand, but relative to some affordance property? Yeah. I don't even know. I don't yet know how to make this work. I see the potential of it, but I'm just thinking about, if you could start doing things like this, and we could start asking questions like this, and I suspect those are more interesting questions and answers for the more complicated movements like that happen in sports. I suspect sometimes coaches are a bit suspicious of us. I saw this great slide on Twitter the other day. It was like the slide 1, slide 2 conundrum. Slide 1, humans are extraordinarily capable of doing all kinds of crazy, amazing things. Slide 2, we measured this by having them press a button.
Yeah.
And so they see us. I think people see us, and they see the big claims in the introduction section, and then they see the button pressing task and the methods. And I think they kind of, anyway. So it was just, you've got me thinking, Rajiv, again about just, we need to up a little bit to get into this.
And I think some of your work, Rajiv, you're doing looking at like task space and null space variability and how that predicts. Unfortunately, you're not getting like simple answers like this predicts, but I think you're starting. I think that's one, like Andrew's saying, because I think the biggest thing I think going back, I think we know how. There's a lot of information about how to use verbal instructions that are consistent with the ecological approach and STEP. I think the biggest thing on the research side is when to step in. What should we be instructing about is still the big open. And I think, so can you tell us a little bit about that work, right? So some of the things you've been finding, I know, looking at how kind of variability relates to learning. And do you see like a path to that I know it's a long way to be able to say, this is not productive variability, this is, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think so the task that I use goes from
you're going back to slide 1.
Like the minimal jump you could make to make it redundant. But I think just like Andrew was saying, I think there's some benefits to keeping it relatively simple just then, rather than jump on all the way through without a full understanding of again, just going beyond task outcomes. I think it's sort of one of my goals, at least, is to understand why. So we have this task where people are doing a throwing task. So they're like doing this. It's sort of like you're sliding this puck on a virtual table, and you have to get to a particular target. So you have to throw it at a particular velocity and land it on the target, as close to the target as possible. The twist here is that participants are actually using both hands here. So the puck is sort of dependent on the sum of the speeds of the two hands. So that means, that gives this redundancy, because you could use, more of your right hand, less of your left hand, sort of 50-50 if you want, if you're equal, and then the other way as well. So there's lots of variability. Even for the same task performance, you could have lots of movement variability. So one of the things, we've been playing around with is, because people are doing this on a robot, we can now apply forces that perturb their movement. So we've been trying to think about from this general idea of, well, there's one component of variability that's bad because it's creating errors, and the other component is good because that's where you have the exploration of the different solutions. We're trying to get that from a causal standpoint, right? So in the sense of, if I make you, now I'm applying forces with the robot and I push you to different parts of the workspace, are you better off at learning compared to somebody who hasn't seen those solutions? And like Rob said, it doesn't seem to be simple in the sense of, one side is good and one side's bad. What we've often found is the amplitude of the variability matters a lot. So it's, again, the sort of variability is good, variability is bad is probably, as you all probably know, it's probably too simple. How much is clearly an important factor. And the other thing that we found in our most recent work, we're trying to get the preprint out soon, is that the variability that you introduce, how it fits with sort of the existing structure of variability also seems to matter. So if your existing structure of variability is along a certain dimension and you introduce a variability along a different direction, that seems to hurt more, even if the task performance is not affected. So it's sort of, there seems to be lots of caveats there in terms of how we understand, even in the simplest task, how variability plays into learning.
Yeah. But I think that's a really interesting approach to try and understand these. Cool. Yeah. I had a couple of questions from a couple of people about, using verbal instructions to direct people to affordances. Maybe this is more Andrew. To me, it almost parallels the I worry about that, the lower dimensional issue to me. To me, I would distinguish directing someone's attention versus educating attention, right? So saying, look at that is very different than use Tau to control your, I don't think you can verbally instruct someone to pick up a certain informational variable. It's way more complex than that.
I feel like it's like the expectation issue again. It's like, I can tell you to look there versus there, but I can't. There's limits on what I can tell you to do in terms of the actual execution or engagement with that point in space. But you have to be looking in the right place, obviously. So you can guide people, you just weren't looking at the right place. It's looking as I'm already conflating attention with vision, right? Just that automatic move. It gets even worse when you're trying to think about attending with other modalities and other sensory systems. How do you know when they're not doing it, right? Am I listening to that thing behind me while I'm looking But I don't think you can verbally tell someone how to affect an affordance. I don't think that makes I don't think you can direct them in the right sort of to look there rather than there. But the actual execution, and then the other thing is that even looking in the same place, you might not see the affordance, right? So if I was, I would think about David Beckham or pick your favorite footballer, right? They see affordances for and opportunities to place balls in all kinds of interesting places that if I was literally standing in the exact same spot and literally looking in the exact same place, I will literally not see what they are seeing, right? So again, it's like you can point them in the right direction, but then absolutely you have to actually, you've got to keep them coupled, right? You've got to then you've actually got to engage with the thing before you can actually, there's a weird sense in which you can literally look at something and not see an affordance, even though it's there.
Yeah.
Especially complex, right?
Yeah. I think that you can, some people are saying you can direct people, to certain areas, look at the spaces, look at the distance, but I think it's a different, frames of reference is probably, it's different language.
Look at the gaps versus look at the players. That's really hard.
Yeah.
For me anyway, it's funny. I think about that because I think it's a sensible thing to do, right? If you're because the gaps are the interesting thing for you. That's the thing you want to coordinate and control your behavior with respect to is the changing gap. But what does it mean to look at a gap, to pay attention to a gap? That's an interesting, it seems like a really easy thing to say, and you can just kind of say it, and you think that you might be able to look at the gap, but and I sort of, if I think about it for slightly more than 3 seconds, that's an awfully odd thing to ask someone to do, and I wonder what my verbal instruction has actually made them do. Yeah. But that was a particular favorite of mine because it's an interesting.
I was thinking of, maybe something like driving, right? I mean, where majority of what we learn is through verbal instruction, right? I mean, there's not a whole lot of other way. I mean, unless you're in a driving simulator, I guess you could do things, but most of us don't learn in a driving simulator. And things like this, right, where you have to merge onto another lane. I mean, you're perceiving the gaps, but you don't, you get instructions like, make sure that car in the mirror is, beyond this thing. I mean, you get some information that potentially helps you identify it. After a while, you're not really thinking about those terms when you're merging into another lane. But, it could be some of these instructions don't have the content in terms of the affordance, but, potentially by way of how they're structured could help you pick up some of it. I think. Yeah.
I thought a lot about it. Like, I got my driver's license quite late, actually. Like, I've only been driving for 10 years or so, and so I thought a lot about it while I was getting instructions about what it was I was learning, because I'm me. And I like that one's really. I always think about the one where you learn to go through a roundabout in the UK, and how my driving instructor was telling me, no, don't go yet because that car's going to turn. I'm like, how gosh, I'm looking at the same car and I can't tell if it's about to keep coming around or whatever because he hasn't got his bloody blinkers on. And then, of course, you have that moment where you can suddenly see it, right? Because But it's interesting. I was thinking about all the verbal instruction that the driver gave me was all about directing my attention to do and it was also directing my attention to look at a certain place, but also to do a certain thing with respect to what it was I had my attention. Because of course, how do you learn how to drive? You get out on the road immediately,
right?
Yeah.
So I was thinking about that as well. It's like, I'm looking for that gap. But not only am I looking for that gap, but I'm keeping an eye on that car. But I'm actually also keeping an eye on that car so that I can pull into the lane in front of or behind it. So that's kind of an interesting idea, actually.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example, Rajiv. I know one of the things sometimes we do, I've seen people do, is try to time headway, your temporal separation to the car in front, which is a complex informational variable. We try to convey it by having you count, in 2 seconds, and which is
the UK distances and niches.
Yeah. You can do it that can give you maybe a very crude way, but any kind of skillful thing like race car driving, there's no, you can't explicitly convey the tangent point of a curve to steer. I don't think there's, so I think, I don't know. I think that's somewhat useful, but I don't know how much you can get really specific about the information. That comes from experience and interaction.
It's a great example because as we're sort of identifying is that it's these verbal instructions are happening in the context of a very coupled perception action system, and none of the instructions are about gaps or affordances or apertures, but that's what you learn. The stopping distance one's really interesting, right? I got really mad at the UK driving test, the actual question test, wanted stopping distances measured in distance, and I had to try and figure it out in terms of time and turn that into a number of meters in order to guess which of the ones it was. But I got thinking about that, and it's like I kind of have this experience now as a driver that's been doing this now. I can kind of perceive that stopping distance, that 2 seconds. I can see. It's like an affordance, what's Fajan's term, that affordance boundary. I can just perceive where I am in relation to that. But why? Because I got that driving instruction about keep a gap and count those 2 seconds, and when you do that, you then get placed in a situation where you are explicitly coordinating and controlling your behavior with respect to the environment. So you're picking up that control information, but you got put in that position by verbal instruction.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting example. And I was just thinking about in relation to coaching. It's not quite the same. That verbal instructions, it's not quite delivered at the same timing. I don't know. did like while someone is running, do coaches yell, look at the gap, look at that play? I don't know.
I think it's more after the fact, kind of like, try to feedback more after what. That reminded me too. I used to joke about learning to drive in Canada, right? They test you on really critical things like 3-point turns and parallel parking, but driving in the snow, you figure that out. But so we do give people this crude verbal instruction, right? If you ever get into a skid, you steer into the skid. Right, you give it that won't work. We used to play around in a parking lot after hockey practice. That's how I learned how to do it, by learning the calibrate doing it. So, but it's really fun. But yeah, the timing of when, so that's something we really didn't touch on, right? There's also before, kind of what you say before, during, reflection, all these kind of different timings as well. Yeah. So I think we've gone past our time, guys. Maybe any last thoughts you want to say about this, if you have any? I think we covered lots as I expected. I don't know if we I didn't expect us to have concrete answers, because I think it's still a evolving topic and question. Go ahead.
I think the ecological community, researchers and coaches, owes the rest of the coaching world an answer to the very important question: what can you do with verbal instructions and what can't you do with them? I think that challenge to us is a very real and sensible and legitimate challenge. And it's got wrapped up in a lot of toxic nonsense on social media. And I mean, when I threw my thread out, I'm going to have to stop doing this. I tend to throw these grenades and then just watch them, because it helps me articulate, it helps me think about what's going on. But it's not, I don't think it's all level. But I think we owe the universe an answer to what is clearly a really important question. And I like, and again, Rajiv, thinking about bringing the academic and the practical together and having them actually talking to another and running in parallel, but with communication and things. Again, I think I don't think us academics are going to quite ask the right questions unless we interface properly with practitioners. Yeah. And vice versa. I really think it sort of goes both ways, but it's clearly on everyone's mind, because this is how this if you want to drop a bomb on sports Twitter, drop this bomb and just walk away and watch, because it's people clearly care, and people really it's a flashpoint for people really giving a damn about what the answer is. And I think we should notice that's how important it is to everybody. Yeah.
Rajiv, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, again, it comes down to, I mean, I'm more I guess I'm less on the theory side than Andrew, but I mean, to me, I'd really like to see, like when we were talking about these concepts, having some good data, either in the coaching world or in the experimental world, to talk about these would be really helpful. And I think, again, if there's some way to organize this effort so we can, more sort of make an advance rather than all relying on our own experiences, I think that potentially will help some fields move forward.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great points. And yeah, so I guess I going back, in the ecological approach, I think we want to say clearly there's room for verbal instruction. It's not coach not doing anything and standing out of the way and doing nothing. That's kind of that's the straw man at the other end, right? So I think as we talked about, I think we're getting a good handle on how if you decide you want to give verbal instruction, how to do it with analogies, explicit. I think the when, the other question I think we got in a little bit in the transition feedback is, if you do use a constraints approach and when do you step in? Do you let people explore randomly forever? And how do you, so I think we still, you're right, Andrew, I think, and Rajiv, it's some of the work we're all doing is trying to understand what are the key features, when should we step in and, try to give a command, because you're right. Giving verbal instructions is the most basic element of being a coach, right? It's the cheapest and most cheerful way, as my former supervisor would say. So, but anyway, so thank you very much, guys. And that was a really fun discussion. I think we'll revisit this later. And I think it's a growing topic, as I said. And thank you everyone for following along in the comments. That's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.
Now hear the winter cut you quick.